All right, folks, thanks for joining us for our July 1st meeting of the Research Triangle PowerShell Users Group. Tonight, we are proud to have Chris Blackden presenting for us tonight. Chris is going to be talking about the Windows system subsystem for Linux and how it works with PowerShell, and more importantly, living in a cross-platform world now, managing Windows and Linux devices. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Chris.
All right, thanks for having me. Yeah, just a little background on this talk. I originally wrote it for the PowerShell Summit this year. I was really excited. First time going to Summit, I couldn't get my manager to pay for it unless I was actually got the DevOps collective to pay for it. And then the world kind of went on pause. So um, Mike was kind enough to give me a spot here. So thank you all for having me. I guess just to start off, I wrote this talk for like an in-person session, so some of these things will work a little bit better in person. It's a little bit weird doing it virtually. We're going to get through this. That'll be fun. So that being said, start off, how many of you all actually work with Linux? PowerShell originally came out for Windows. It was a scripting language for Windows only. Didn't work on Linux until about 2016. But Stack Overflow developer survey, it's about half of all development is done for a Linux system, a little bit more than that. And if you want to take that a little bit further, developers' primary operating systems are typically Linux based. It's a little bit over half of it's Mac OS or Linux, and Windows comes in at just over 45%. So
You're
it made
definitely
sense.
getting some you're definitely getting some love for Linux in the chat and in
Oh, yeah.
people raising their hand for sure.
So that's another thing I should probably mention. My screen setup's a little bit weird. Uh, and the one I really dislike Mac and Apple products. I'm a bit of a Windows or Linux guy, but not Mac. There's going to be times during the talk where I flip back and forth, and if I'm here, I can't see what anyone's typing. So I'm going to come back here and ask for questions at some point. But yeah, I have no idea what y'all are saying when I'm here.
Don't worry,
Just
Chris.
a
We'll
little
we'll,
heads
we'll
up.
take care of it.
Yeah, the one thing I will say about Mac is they got a mission control. That thing is great, but everything else, no. But yeah, speaking of that, when it comes to developers' operating systems, it really makes sense why Microsoft open sourced PowerShell. And this is from the State of the Shell keynote not too long ago. But if you look at the Linux start numbers, it's ridiculous how many more Linux machines are running PowerShell now. So now the focus is on how to make the developer experience better on Windows. And that's where the WSL or Windows Subsystem for Linux comes in. So this talk, we're going to go over 4 points here. Installing WSL, getting started with it, some more advanced stuff to make it interesting, make it useful, and then write some cross-platform PowerShell, give you some tips and tricks for validating it on both Windows and Linux. And then we're going to run a little test for WSL. That should be kind of fun. So let's start off with installing. It's really easy to install. That's it. Well, almost. That command is it's straight from Microsoft Build 2020. On a version of Windows that's coming out at some point, that'll be all you need to run, but we are not there yet. So in the meantime, it's just a couple of features, and um, you set the WSL2 as your default. And this is probably a good time to talk about different versions of WSL. There's WSL 1 and 2. WSL 1 was kind of Microsoft's first attempt at doing Windows Subsystem for Linux. It ran all of the commands through a Pico driver, which then it took the syscall command and then translated that in a way that Linux would understand. It didn't really work all that well. It was pretty slow. So overall, Microsoft abandoned it when they made WSL2, which it runs the commands natively on virtualized components because it's actually using a real Linux kernel that gets updated with Windows updates. If you'd have told me that 5 years ago, I never would have believed you, but that's kind of been 2020 in a nutshell. Nothing this year is believable. But once you install those, you can really just install Windows or install Linux on Windows from the Microsoft Store. But if you're anything like me, you probably don't like using the Windows Store for anything. You'd rather use the command line. So now we get into demos, and I promise you I'm almost done with slides. That's most of the slides. The rest of it's code from here on out. So to start off, there's actually a way to sideload, since you can install since you can install Linux distributions from the Microsoft Store, Windows actually treats them like Windows Store apps. So you can actually sideload them if you want. If let's take a look at my repo here. And you see I've actually got this ubuntu.apex here, but you can also download it from Microsoft if you want to, just using a curl or invoke web request, and then sideload it with an add apex package. Now again, that's not going to work for me. I'll try and cancel out of this just because I didn't fully download that, and really that's not how we want to be doing it anyways. If you are downloading a development workspace, you want to add some customizations to it, right? So go back up here to the directory, and you'll see I've also got a godist.tar. Now, WSL actually lets you import distributions from a tar file. So if you run a WSL import on Go distro, and then this is it takes two parameters. One is where to put the file system, and the other one is which tar file you want to load. I've actually already done that too. So if I run a WSL-L-V, I've got a few different distributions here. Each of these could be a custom workspace. They could be Ubuntu or CentOS or Alpine or whatever have you. But you can download these distributions, make your configurations to them, install Z-Shell or set up your prompt any way you want to. And then there's a WSL export command that will actually take that distribution and export it to another tar file that you can then distribute out to your teams, put on a share, whatever have you. Now it's going to take a while to run, so I'm going to quit out of that too. But even just running it for that little bit, you see it was creating that file for us already. And then that's really cool. You know, you can distribute distributions as a tar file, makes it easy, but there's probably a better way to do it, right? You're setting up a development workspace. So what if you treat your development workspace like a developer would? So if we go a step further with that, I have in this repo a Docker file, and this is just a Golang Docker file with some customizations to it. I'm installing Vim, I'm installing curl, I'm installing Git, and I'm setting up a user with my super secure password right there. But if you want, we could actually build that Docker file and then run it. Some of you are probably familiar with Docker run. How many of you are familiar with Docker export? So I'm going to open up another pane here, and actually I can run Docker export. Oh, that's fun. So let's actually not get ahead of ourselves here and run a Docker PS. There's my running container. Let's copy the container ID for that. And then by running Docker export, passing in where I want this tar file to download to, and then passing in the container ID, it is, I see it on my other screen here. I'll show you all in a minute, but it's actually making a tar file based on the Docker file I have here that I can then import as a WSL distribution. So I've just versioned my development environment as code and can set up a pipeline just around setting up other developers for my environment. So just by running the WSL import command that I showed you earlier. I'm not going to do that because I've already got it set up, but you can get into some really fun territory here. So just to recap, I promise you I'm almost done with slides, but you can download it from the Windows Store. You can run Sideload as a Windows app X package. You can distribute a tar file, or you can just build your whole WSL distro from a Docker file. Do you have any questions before I go on?
Nope. Nope. Just everybody's highly impressed that you could do that.
Yeah. I'm seeing something in the chat about my power line config. I actually just wrote an article on how I set mine up. I have a few tweaks to it that I'll go over in a bit. But yeah, just ping me afterwards. I'll help you set that up. Minimum version of Windows for WSL2. I think that just went GA. Like that was one of the things that happened since Summit was supposed to have happened. Is it actually just went GA? So. All right, I don't see anything else, so I'm going to go on ahead. I'm going to talk about some advanced WSL, and like I said, I'm done with slides. We're going straight into the demo. Yeah. All right. So, taking you all back to PowerShell 101. If I run ls in a PowerShell window, that's going to run, it's not actually ls, right? It's alias for get child item. ls being the Linux command for listing files in a directory. So if I wanted to use the same syntax that I'm familiar with from Linux, it's not going to work because it's trying to run get child item with some parameters that sound weird. But since I have WSL installed, I can run WSL and then pass to it ls, and that will run it as if it's a Linux command using my default WSL distribution. So then by using my WSL-AL, it works exactly as I'd expect it to on Linux. And you can use this with just about anything on the command line. So if I want to run Go here on my Windows machine, Windows doesn't know what the hell I'm talking about. There's no Go installed here. Same if on my default distribution, I want to run Go version. I don't have that installed on my default WSL distribution. So if I take a look at my different distributions, my default one here is the one with the star, Ubuntu 2004. And I've got a few other distributions here as well. These could each be different development environments, or they could have different SSH keys. You can set these up pretty much any way you want to. They're all pretty well isolated, but you have access to all of them from the command line. So if I pass in a -d flag and run the same Go version command with the Go distro, WSL distro, that's going to work because that's built from, that's the one I just built using the Docker file with Golang installed.
Hey, Mr. Chris.
Yes.
So there's a few of us, like myself, who are hardcore Windows only guys. So if you are passing those Linux commands and you're doing like -d or whatever, if you could call out what some of those switches are doing from time to time, I just don't know them.
Oh yeah, sure. So the only one I think I've used so far is -al. So if I do WSL ls, it's just going to bring back the file names, right? It's got no other information about them. AL is it's going to give me some other information about it, like dates, last date modified, permissions, users, etc.
I didn't know what the -d was on
Yeah.
your.
So WSL is actually a Windows command. It's got some flags. -d is just specifying a distro. So if let me clear the screen here. No, please call me out on these, by the way, if I'm not making sense or I'm moving too fast. But basically what I'm saying when I run WSL ls is I'm saying, or let's do go version, is I'm saying use my default WSL distribution to run anything I pass into that WSL command. The WSL go version is going to run go version on my default distribution. But if I want to specify a different distribution that I know has the tools, oh, it didn't like that at all. There we go. -D is just going to tell WSL use this distribution instead of the standard default distribution. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
No problem. You can. So here's another fun thing. You can also do it with users. WSL. Let's run a WSL who am I, and it's going to run Ubuntu because that's the default username on my default WSL distribution. But let's say I need to run as a different user. Using the -u parameter, I'm going to tell WSL which user I want to run that command as. And it'll run under that user instead of under my default user.
So Chris, you may be getting ahead. I might be getting ahead of you, but can you do like some pretty advanced stuff with like set and awk and grep and stuff like that? You can do through WSL straight up like this, or you need to go into the distribution and work like that way.
You can do either or. I'm so full disclosure here. I actually only started working on Linux professionally like a year and a half ago. Before then, I was pure Windows, just the same. So all of this stuff is like, I can use awk pretty well, but sed is just weird. I know I'm going to make some enemies on that one, and probably a few other things I'm going to say during this talk, but that's just the truth of it.
And Chris, does WSL give you any command completion like the PowerShell console?
Not at this time. I think there's probably a module for it or something. Let's say if I wanted to use that distribution example again, I'm hitting tab right now. I couldn't tab complete a distribution name. Any other questions before I move on? All right, great. So if I just run WSL without parameters, it's going to open up the command line. Some of you might be a little more familiar with this. This is a Z shell on my Ubuntu default WSL instance. So we just ran who am I from there. It runs the same here. And that's what you'd expect from a Linux distribution. But since this is WSL, it's not just Linux. It's running on the same device as your host operating system. If you're more familiar with virtualization, think of it like host and guest, except the guest operating system has some access to the host operating system that it wouldn't normally, namely the path variable. So if I run, I'm inside WSL, I ran who am I, and it returned the WSL Linux user. If I run whoami.exe, it's going to return that from my Windows user because it's actually reaching out to System32 and running the whoami.exe executable from there. So this is from the local file system, which WSL creates when you start it. And that's from System32. It's worth noting you do have access to your Windows file system. It's just under a mount point on your WSL distro. So in this case, it's on my C drive, Windows System32, whoami.exe.
Is that mount point read-only?
No, you can do either or. I think it's configurable, but by default, it's not. All right. Another thing this makes it pretty cool actually if you have like tools you want to share among your distros, but you don't want to configure them all. So one of the things I do a lot of is Terraform. So let's switch repos here for a minute. And if I do a Terraform init, again, my WSL distro doesn't know what I'm talking about here, but I have Terraform installed on my host operating system. So if I had set an alias for Terraform to terraform.exe, it's going to run just fine. So let's get out of WSL and clear the screen. One more thing that you can do, again, I'm back on my host operating system running Windows PowerShell 7. And I love Chocolatey, so I install everything I have with Chocolatey. I'm gonna actually list the things I have with Chocolatey LO. And that's this is gonna be a lot of information because I use it for a lot of stuff. But if I wanted to filter that a little bit, I can pipe that into WSL and then use the Linux grep to search for something like Terraform. So pretty cool stuff. One more thing, just in case you thought I was done, is if you're using Visual Studio Code with the remote extensions, you can actually go straight into a WSL distribution as a Visual Studio Code remote. So here I'm just saying run code with the remote distro, WSL plus the Go distro. And then I'm actually going to do the same folder I've been in, just using Go files, which is another subdirectory I have here. And that's going to open up off screen, so I'll just drag it over here. And you see it's down here, it's opening the remote in WSL. And then I can just switch user. I do have it installed on my WSL distro. All right, so let's clear out of that. And that's it for this demo right now.
Hey, Chris,
Are there any questions so far?
David had mentioned something about if you write to files, it could mess up your permissions due to the difference between Linux and Windows permissions. Do you have any experience? Have you had that happen?
I've had it happen a couple of times. I don't have any good advice for you because every time I think I've found a way around it, Microsoft changes how WSL works. So right now, I just say if you're going to be using WSL, try not to rely on files that are on your Windows operating system. Just work on something that you're pulling in from Git and don't have the dependencies for. Yeah, there's definitely a very long GitHub issue discussing it. Oh yeah. Anything else before I move on?
I don't know if you knew, Chris, but you can, in your terminal options for your WSL distros, you can pass a -u flag so that it opens with the user that you want instead of root by default. I've noticed that after I've imported distros back in.
So this is where I get when I'm setting up for demos, I do things differently than I would on development. Like on my development system, I have a terminal set up that has it just SSHs into an EC2 instance. Like I've got my cert hard coded and things, and it just, as soon as I open up that profile, it'll go straight to EC2. But yeah, you can do some crazy things with the Windows terminal. I think I saw a blog post, someone even running like a PowerShell remoting session just from a Windows terminal. But yeah, there's some crazy stuff there. I just don't set that up for demos because then I can show up.
Perfect.
All right, and now to the meat of it, what you've all been waiting for, the cross-platform PowerShell on WSL. So let's go back over to demos. And I'll actually split my terminal here a little bit. It's always a little weird when I do it at first. Can everyone see that okay?
You're good.
All right. So just a start off with a few tips and tricks. If you tried some of this stuff with PowerShell 6, then you'll know that test path and PowerShell 6 in particular is pretty picky about file paths. I've got here, let me just pull this over, put a little context here. I've got a directory here. It's just a bunch of random directory names just to help illustrate. If you need to navigate in, you can do it. PowerShell 7 doesn't really care about path separators. It really doesn't. PowerShell 7 doesn't care. It just works. The same is also true for capital letters. As long as you still have a valid path, doesn't care. PowerShell 7 knows that what you're trying to do, regardless of case sensitivity or directory separator, which is pretty neat.
Yeah, but Chris, you're saying it doesn't care, but I think what really means is just it's coded to handle both slashes, right?
Sure.
Because I'm sure those slashes come back to burn you other ways on other stuff later on.
I'm actually going to go over that in just a little bit. But yeah, it's not that it doesn't care. It's just a fun thing to say. But there is actually a .NET class for it that I'm going to cover in just a bit. Yeah, there are some things that PowerShell 7 does care very much about, and that's environmental variables. So that works fine on Windows because it's one of the presets, but Linux doesn't know what you're talking about. Same with username, right? I can have a username environmental variable that I can assume is going to be there on Windows, but not on Linux. Let's clear the screen a little bit. One way to get around that is, like I kind of alluded to earlier, you can go straight into the .NET class for environment, and that'll pull back the same machine name consistently each time. Because that's really what trouble you're going to get into when you're doing cross-platform scripting, is some things are going to be consistent no matter where you run them, and some aren't. So it's the same with username, but with a little bit different. So in this case, it's pulling back the username from my Windows host system. And on WSL, it's pulling back the default username from my or the currently running username from my WSL distro. You can kind of see there's a lot here that you can work with and experiment with. These are just a couple of neat examples, but if you do need to have some consistency across your scripts, you might be better off forgetting about pre-built variables, going straight to the .NET class itself. And let's clear the screen. Another place that you might see is consistent, but only a little bit, is the path variable. So I mentioned that WSL actually does look up the Windows system path. Here it is on my Windows host machine, and here it is on WSL. It's just a little bit different, but it's mostly the same. So the path separators are going to be consistent with what's expected on each platform. That kind of interpretation is happening on both sides. Like WSL or PowerShell 7 on Linux, excuse me, knows that it's trying to run with a / instead of a / and it knows it's running with C mount instead of C:. And that is where I go into the io.path class. This is how .NET Core knows which is which on each system. So these are going to be different across each platform. And if you're writing something that does need to be compatible, you have that available to you if you need like a specific directory separator for whatever you need. But yeah, if you want to go back to environment variables for just a second, that's all the environment variables I have on my Windows device. And it's a lot. I think I have it's 55 here. I run the same thing on Linux. It doesn't set nearly as many. It's only at 29. So don't ever assume that things are going to be available on either session. or excuse me, on either platform. WSL does have this WSL env, which you can configure to share additional paths across the two. I didn't prep a demo for that, but if someone wants to ask me about it afterwards, I'd be fine with that too. But yeah, you can configure your WSL env to share path variables between Windows and Linux.
So Chris, can I stop you for a second? And you know, you're doing a great job, but there's a couple people in that may, you know, have wanted to just get to the basics of WSL and just give an idea as to, you know, at least somebody's confused as to what WSL is effectively. Is it like a hypervisor machine? Is it something running inside? Like from the very basic minimum, you know, can you give a quick little description of what WSL is?
Yeah, no problem. Please, yeah, please interrupt me if I go from 0 to 100. But yeah, that being said, WSL is actually it's running in a virtual machine on WSL2, excuse me, is running on a virtual machine on Windows. So I think it was Hyper-V at one point, and I don't know if it still is. They've changed it every time I look at it.
So does that mean that again for us Windows Linux noobs, is this going to show up in System Manager as a process that's killable? I would assume yes.
Yeah, actually, so we can see it right now. Oh, that looks awful. So you can kind of see WSL host right here. And
Nice.
if I run a WSL, you see I've actually got only 2 running WSL distros right now. This one's kind of in a weird state, but that'll be a story for another time.
So a good explanation, which I think I can, or at least that makes sense in my head, is, you know, some people have seen like VirtualBox or, you know, a bunch of the other virtualization tools, and so like that is what you see VSL host running that process in that one. But then it also does some extra stuff for you. It integrates deeply into Windows where it's pretty seamless. It's not this, you know, subset Windows like VMware, you know, workstation where you then need to then map some drives and share disks and all that kind of stuff. It's doing all that stuff for you in the background behind the scenes. And kind of what, you know, Chris is doing here is you can see it automatically maps in your C drive, it maps in your drives, it does all that seamlessly, so it's a completely seamless interaction.
Yeah, I couldn't have said that better myself. Like the WSL is basically it's running a full Linux kernel, but it's doing a lot of this integration with Windows that you to kind of give you the just some extra tools and features and capabilities to it. But it is really a Linux kernel. Back here. Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That's awesome. It's a nice diagram. In different instances of PowerShell, could you run different distros simultaneously? Yeah, if you have the Windows terminal, you can open up different distros side by side. Or let's see, I can actually do it right now. Let's yeah. These are all PowerShell and CMD, but terminal's pretty cool at that. You can run different distributions just in the same window side by side. And then if I run the same thing, it's running a couple of these now. Yeah, great questions, guys. Like I said, I do have a tendency to go from 0 to 100, so stop me if I'm disrupting the group at all. I can't see your chat while I'm here.
No,
Hey,
listen, man,
Chris.
you're doing awesome, brother. We were just talking on a sidebar that I just think this is a topic that is not well understood by a lot of people. So there's a lot of foundational knowledge that people are trying to work out in their head. But you're doing a fantastic job.
All right, cool. Thanks, guys.
I have a question, Chris.
Shoot.
That's it's not so much a technical one, but could you explain like some of the use cases? Like, what are some of some of the ways that you use this on a daily basis? Why do I care that Windows and Linux run together?
So especially like I work on a lot of different on a microservices platform. So basically, I'm a DevOps guy. I have developers writing Python, writing Java, writing Golang, writing whatever have you. And I don't necessarily understand all of those, and I don't necessarily need to have all of them installed on my local machine. Um, Especially if you have like if you're a developer, you're developing on like Python 3.7 and you want to test out 3.8 in a sandbox that's not going to any way impact your 3.7 environment. WSL, that's its time to shine. You can have two of those different distros side by side, one of them running Python 3.7, the other running Python 3.8, and just try things side by side using the same code base. Does that kind of answer your question, or?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So,
No
so
problem.
your driver, Chris, is because you have a cross-platform environment to support, and it's just easier than having to set up all these dedicated environments. So you're saying basically because I can basically run this and I can mount different Linux distros almost on the fly,
Yeah,
you spin them up on an as-needed basis rather than having to instantiate all these VMs that run and consume memory and resources.
essentially, yeah. Like think about how you'd set up a development environment beforehand. You either put everything on your host machine and hope it doesn't break anything else, or you'd set up like a virtual machine like Hyper-V or VirtualBox, or even like an Azure VM or an EC2 instance, and then run some Ansible playbook to install all of these. WSL kind of gives you a way to abstract all of that and make it a little bit easier to run. Let's see. I did have one more thing to cover, a couple more things to cover in this section. If you're like, if you've ever had the unfortunate experience of having to convert a script, like a Linux shell script or a Windows batch to run on something else, it's a bit of a pain in the ass. So I can run date on Windows PowerShell, and it runs basically get date. That's what it's doing in the background. But the date command in Linux, even if I'm running it with a PowerShell session, it's going to run the native date command from Linux. So you can actually go and save those to a variable. And when you do a get type, you see that on Windows, it's making a datetime object. And on Linux, it's a string. So, and this is where I'm going to make a lot of enemies here. Everything on Linux is text in a file. And it's weird for me as like a DevOps guy, because I go and my friends and family who don't do any technical stuff, I say to them, yeah, we're always on the cutting edge of everything, but the primary way we interact with our systems is a 40-year-old string manipulator. That's all Bash is. You're just manipulating text in a file. And PowerShell is a full object-oriented programming language, so you can do a lot more with it. But you also run into some pitfalls, like if you want to cast a datetime object as another datetime object, this is how you do that in PowerShell, and that works just fine. But if you do the same thing from the Linux date command, it doesn't know what you're talking about because the datetime object is not set up to understand this as a date and time. So what you can do, there's a few gotchas like this, where if you have the date command with some additional formatting, that will work just fine, but that's something you have to be aware of if you're converting these scripts over from Bash or something else to PowerShell. And of course, there's always get date, which runs fine on both.
So effectively, that's just because the datetime constructor doesn't doesn't take that string of text.
Right.
It can't parse that properly. It just
Exactly.
The constructor goes, "You're in the wrong format."
Right, because the datetime object set up to I don't even know if that's a bug or a feature, if it's even that important, but just the datetime constructor doesn't know what the Linux date command is trying to say.
Or
It's
I think
always a
just that
feature.
text that yeah, it's a feature. That text that's returned because it's wed and all that kind, it just can't parse that properly.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah. There's one other cool feature from PowerShell. I think they introduced this in 6, but you can use is Windows, is Mac OS, or is Linux. And these are built-in variables now. So this will return is Windows true on Windows, but when I take this over to WSL, it's going to run is Linux is true instead. And I can't take credit for this one. This is from Tyler Leonhardt. I can't pronounce his name, but from the PowerShell team. But what he suggested was put a switch statement in there. If it's Windows, you'll get this, Mac OS this, and Linux is going to be Linux. But these variables didn't go back to Windows PowerShell, as in PowerShell 5.1. So if you're running that on a Windows PowerShell session, in fact, let me open that up. Let me get a Windows PowerShell session here. And if I run this in PowerShell 7, it's going to evaluate as PowerShell 7. If I run this on Linux, it's going to evaluate it as Linux, and Windows PowerShell as Windows PowerShell.
It's cool.
I use a variation of this to make this this prompt, which is I think there was a question about that earlier. Right, so let me clear this off. Oh, I almost forgot. There's one more thing. So I said earlier, these are different operating systems. They're pretty isolated. I've actually left a commit in my Git repo. I have an SSH key on this version on my WSL instance that can push up to my GitHub repository, but not on this Windows one here. So if I run a git push on Windows, it's not going to work. But the same git push from here is going to be using the other SSH key. So these are pretty well isolated systems. There's not a lot of escaping from, like escaping processes, and WSL does have its own file system, so you don't have to. You can access it or you can cut it off, but it's flexible like that.
Now, is that only working because it's not in like the environment, or?
It's running the same git command, but it's actually using. Let's see. It's using different keys. So if I do SSH,
Yeah, because it's in your home drive.
right, it's not showing my private key on. Oh,
well, effectively that's what it is. So it's in
yeah,
that user's profile versus your other one doesn't have one.
exactly, yeah. And like I said, you can build these to whatever spec you want with a Docker file even. So if you wanted to package up an SSH key or have it so that you're only connecting to AWS or Azure from these built files, you can do that too.
And Chris, can you set up a shared area where all these machines can see files?
Yeah, actually, I'm here back in on some of the newer Windows builds. I think this is a preview feature, but there's actually it's a share $WSL that will take you more or less to here. And these are all of my WSL distros and the file systems for each.
Blow your mind.
Yeah, again, if you'd have told me 5 years ago that any of this would be possible, I'd laugh you off. But 2020 is changing things.
Oh, and can your Windows PowerShell read from the WSL Ubuntu image?
Yes, but I honestly couldn't, let's see. So this is a, oh, I think I did this earlier. Nope. No. I might have taken it off. Oh, here it is. So, yeah, I set this up earlier just playing around with it, but oh no, this isn't what I wanted either. Yeah, I had it working a while ago, and there is a way to do it. WSL 1, it was a lot easier because it was, like I said in my other slide, it was using the same components, so the same file system. It was really just a folder under your Windows apps. WSL 2, it's actually technically running a VHDX. So actually, let me do this. So when I did the one of the last demos, I think it was the first one, I ran this command, WSL import. And you see I've actually got like, this doesn't come with this, I set that up. But my under my user profile, when I'm importing a distro, it's asking me where to store it. And this is that folder on my file system. So if I open up Go distro, that's a VHDX that I can potentially then mount or interact with using using the WSL share.
Would you mind showing us on both of these Git PS provider?
Sure. Yeah, so let's see. I think it's even WSL $, so yeah, it's one of these. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I can't remember what it is now, but I'll look it up after the session and I'll put it in the chat.
Wouldn't it be LS $WSL?
Yeah, it looks. I thought so, but it's not working that way. Let's see.
No, I bet you don't
Yeah.
have a variable for $WSL, and so it's returning the local directory or the current directory because
Yeah.
WSL is null.
Yeah, so I thought it was like an admin share, like $. If you're doing like remoting into another file system, you can use like //C $ whatever. But that's not working for me now for whatever reason. I think I'm just got this part. I'm doing something here wrong. I'll look it up and I'll post it in the chat. So let's see, any questions? No, actually, so the question is, when can we run WSL on Windows Server? I think it's actually there now in Server 2019. If you want to run it in production, that's up to you. You're a brave soul, but I mean, to me, it's not there yet. It's more for local development than anything.
And Chris, what is the compatibility of some of these environments with the Windows virtual environment and VMware and VirtualBox? Are there things you can't run together, have on the same machine?
So I've run for my Pluralsight stuff, I use VirtualBox for a lot of that, and I've run that side by side with WSL. But I'm also on an experimental build that broke that. This is a fun story. About 2 hours before this talk, I found out that the Docker build I was using, because Docker, the new Docker desktop for Windows is also using WSL 2. And I actually tried to start up some of the demos, and I found out that my Docker had completely crashed WSL. I had to reinstall it about 2 hours before all this. So
That's always fun.
oh yeah, 2020 strikes again. But yeah, I actually asked Microsoft support about that, because it's like I can't be with one or the other. I use both of them too frequently. But yeah, you can use WSL with VirtualBox or VMware, and you just take a slight performance hit.
But you also have to have the right level, because they added support where the VirtualBox or VMware would use Hyper-V under the covers. You
That's
have
right.
to have the right version of VirtualBox.
Any other questions before I move on? All right, cool. So now we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to put WSL to the test. And there's actually only one way to know if it's any good or not. It's a well-known test that's been used for over 25 years to see if any new technology is going to stick around. Can it run Doom? And first of all, that is a great punchline. But secondly, there's actually a couple more reasons I'm using Doom. Back when the Doom source code was open sourced, it only compiled on Linux. There was actually a copyright issue with one of the sound libraries. So you even the instructions to compile it on Windows are just installing like Cygwin or something and running it there. But let's actually see if we can get WSL to run on Doom. Or the other way around, you heard what I meant. So back here, I have my directory here. I have, let's go ahead and I have two things here. I have a Docker file and actually a tar. We talked about building WSL images with a Docker file. So this is just, this is my Docker file. I'm installing quite a few things on there. I spent way more time on this than I should have.
So can I stop you there for quickly?
Please do,
What
yeah.
is bat? What is bat?
Oh, bat is like a clone of cat. So the cat command in Linux will just display the contents of a file. It doesn't look very nice, but it works. Bat is just a really, it prints it out pretty.
With line numbers but it's still just a. Can you move up and down and jump to a line? Kind of. I see the dollar quotes.
Oh, yeah, I'm moving up and down with arrow keys right now, and then you can run grep and everything else still, but it's just it looks better on a screen.
Interesting. Cool. Sorry. Thanks. Sorry for
Oh, no worries, no worries. But yeah, Microsoft has said that they're actually bringing graphical support for WSL. I didn't want to wait that long, so I found a bunch of open source desktop and RDP packages. And then this is a server. This one needs to be installed manually because it's got some interactive prompts to it. And then, of course, I've got my user Doom guy. So let's get out of there. And a little confession to make. I've been running it in the background this whole time. You can see I'm actually using a folder on my D drive. I have a drive for a lot of my GitHub repositories. And this is just under Chocolate Doom under data. And I did build it. I'm not going to go through and do that here because that took a long time to do. But what we can do now that we're here is run Doom on WSL. So this is where I was gonna get in a lot of trouble at Summit, because if you say to if your manager says to you when you get back, like, oh, what did you learn at conference this year? And you come back and say, well, I learned how to install video games on a secret operating system. It's probably not going to go too well for next year's conference budget. So there is a point to all this, and the point is that you can run pretty much anything from a Linux system that you need to without going through all the extra steps of running Sigwin or any kind of translation layers.
That's really cool.
So instead of RDPing to the instance, can I do X forwarding? Could you use PuTTY to do that and then not have to RDP in, but still run it on against the local system?
I'm not sure about that. That'd be interesting though. Yeah, I just do SSH if I need to. And it's like I stay away from PuTTY like the plague since Microsoft started supporting OpenSSH. All right, but that's it. There's some code samples and instructions and the PowerPoint slides here if anyone's interested. Otherwise, I think that's my time. And if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
So first off, let me say, Chris, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Now, my background is a Windows guy, and me being able to follow along with what you said and actually have some interest in Linux goes to show you that you did a good job. Because, man, I found that very, very intriguing.
Thank you.
So let's leave that there. So first off, I want to say thank you to Chris for presenting tonight. Excellent job, Chris. Take a look for more stuff at rtpsug.com. And thanks for joining us tonight.